Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We are so glad that you can join us. I know many of you are listening in from afar, which is why we provide these free online webinars, so parents and professionals alike can register for any of our free online events and have access to evidence-based updates explained by highly qualified expert presenters. We host multiple webinars each month, so please visit our website at autism.org to view the schedule. And we also continually add webinars, so if you're not on our email list, visit autism.org and click subscribe on the homepage to receive regular updates. To get instant news and events from ARI, you may also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. This webinar will be recorded, and playback will be available later today at autism.org/webinars, as well as on our YouTube channel. No continuing medical education credits are provided for this talk, but free certificates of participation are available upon successful completion of a brief knowledge quiz after the webinar. The quiz link will be on the webinar page approximately 2 hours following the talk. These webinars are made possible by generous donor support, and if you would like to contribute, you can visit autism.org to donate. Now I'll pass it over to Petra Dillman to introduce the World Autism Organization.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Thank you. We, the Council and the members of the WAO, the World Autism Organization, are grateful to the Autism Research Institute for having us regularly join them for selected webinars. Since its foundation in 1983, Autism Europe has had a vision that all people with autism, regardless of class, race, gender, or creed, are entitled to the benefits of diagnosis and appropriate education and lifelong support, and above all, to be treated with respect and dignity. To this end, Autism Europe prepared a Charter of Rights for people with autism, and in 1996, a written declaration on their rights was approved in the European Parliament. In 1998, Autism Europe, in response to growing requests from associations dedicated to the welfare of people with autism around the world, established the World Autism Organization as an international network on autism to provide a global response to the needs of people with autism and their families, and to promote the implementation of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with a Disability, as well as urging governments to implement their Sustainable Development Goals. People with autism have an indisputable right to live independently, self-advocacy and involvement as far as possible in decisions affecting their future, accessible and appropriate education, housing assistance, care and support services, as well as sufficient income, freedom from fear, threat, and from abusive treatment. We, as persons with autism advocating for ourselves and parents advocating for our children with autism, with the contribution of professionals who share our views, pledge ourselves to these rights to be enhanced and enforced by appropriate legislation worldwide. The objectives and functions can be looked up in our Constitution, which is accessible through the website. I'm Petra Dillman, mother of Michael, who is 36 years old and a non-speaking autistic. I've been involved in autism for the past 35 years and have been on the WAO Council since 2000. Furthermore, I'm the founder and director of the Autism Association of Namibia, and I'm very pleased and happy to announce that the 6th World Autism Congress will take place in Windhoek, Namibia, from the 3rd to 5th November in 2026. And for those of you going to the Autism Europe Congress in Dublin, Pier Angelo Capai from the Associazione di Diversamente ODV, who is the current WAO president-elect, will have flyers about the Congress. Save the date, and an email address to get you onto the database will be posted on the WAO website from tomorrow onwards. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Petra. My name is Dr. Steve Adelson, and I'm the Chief Science Officer of the Autism Research Institute in San Diego, California. Let me now say a few words about the Autism Research Institute, or ARI. ARI was founded by pioneering researcher and parent advocate Dr. Bernard Bremland in 1967. This is our 58th year of monitoring, supporting, and conducting research. More specifically, ARI funds research studies, sponsors an international support group network with over 260 member groups, as well as a science network. We sponsor think tank meetings, publish original articles and books, and produce videos and webinars, and a lot more. So you could learn a lot more about ARI at www.autism.org. So let me now introduce our speaker today. Dr. Mary Dougherty is a clinical associate professor at University College Dublin School of Medicine and consultant anesthesiologist based in Ireland. As founder of Autistic Doctors International, she has brought together a community of over 1,200 autistic medical doctors from across the world with a focus on peer support, advocacy, research, and training. Her research interests include healthcare for autistic people, as well as experiences and support needs of autistic medical students and doctors. She developed the Autistic SPACE framework for meeting the needs of autistic people in healthcare settings. So please welcome Dr. Mary Dougherty.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be with you today. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about the work that I have been doing. As I'm listening to, the decades of advocacy work that you've all been involved in, I'm, thinking about how we think about autism has just, has changed so dramatically over the last couple of decades. What I want to talk to you today is some of the work that we've been doing in Autistic Doctors International. And that's an organization that I founded a few years ago, not nearly as long as the organizations you guys represent. We started in 2019, but I'll tell you a little bit more about that as we go on. First of all, I just want to acknowledge the artwork, which is produced by our deputy lead in ADI, in Autistic Doctors International, Mr. James Henderson. He's a consultant plastic surgeon in Bristol in the UK. So he's done all the fabulous drawings. And I want to start by saying positionality is everything. And that's what this, what the drawing represents. It's recognizing for yourself whether you see the world through a neurodivergent lens or not, whether that's looking at the details of a rose or looking at the universe. A lot of people think they're looking through a neurotypical lens when actually they're not. And it really helps to know. I look back over my own life, my own career. I had no idea that I was autistic, that I was looking through that neurodivergent lens. But this is where it all started for me. These are my two munchkins. My journey into the world of autism started back when my second child, who's now 17, was about 3, and his preschool teacher suggested that he might have sensory issues. I had no idea what that meant. Absolutely no clue. I mean, looking back, it was really obvious, but I had no idea that, they were like the way he was in the world was just really, typically autistic. I didn't know that that's what it meant. And what was really poignant for us as a family was that my older girl at the time was experiencing really significant mental health problems. And looking back, what she needed was neurodevelopmental assessment. But back then, this is, 15 years ago, nobody knew anything about neurodivergence in girls. The dominant narrative around autism was, small white boys throwing chairs, not speaking. There was no suggestion or no awareness that girls could be neurodivergent as well. And as I look back, she had such a hard time for so many years. We nearly lost her, and so much of that was potentially preventable. And I see that replicated in the autistic community. And that's very much what drives so much of the advocacy work that I do, because I know that the way we frame autism has profound effect on outcome, and that I have no doubt that a neurodiversity affirmative approach is the way to achieve optimum outcomes for all autistic people, no matter what the profile of strengths and needs are. I'm going to talk to you, as I said, about Autistic Doctors International and give you some of our data from our membership survey. And then I'm going to talk about a project that I did looking at autistic psychiatrists. It's worth saying at this point that there's some tricky themes in that. It's a bit difficult, you know. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to talk about this, but I do want to say that it's maybe not something to listen to if you're in a particularly vulnerable state today. So maybe, you know, leave, go, you know, have a break and maybe come back to the recording on a different day. There is some potentially distressing content, particularly around shame and stigma and mental health. But we'll get onto that in a bit. And now I'm going to want to talk to you about recognizing autistic people, whether it's colleagues, patients, loved ones, and then how that all fits in with, you know, diagnosis and disclosure, and in particular, as I said, shame. If we have some time, I'll touch on the healthcare barriers briefly and the Autistic SPACE framework. But I particularly want to talk to you about the Psych Project today. You can find more about my work and all the stuff that we've done in ADI. This is my recently published PhD. I deal with my own shame when it comes to looking at my own career, and at this stage in my life, just completing my PhD. That, you know, I mean, if I had known that I was autistic years ago and been appropriately supported, I would probably have had a very different career path. And, you know, there is some regret and shame around that for me. But, you know, we embrace it and do what we can. So that's available online if you're interested. In terms of learning outcomes, whenever I'm talking about autism healthcare, the goal for me is that all healthcare providers will become not just autism aware, but autism competent. And then second, with that, the goal for me is that all autistic kids have the opportunity to grow up confidently autistic, because that is the way for optimum outcomes. Today, I want to talk about how can insights from autistic doctors, and particularly autistic psychiatrists, contribute to that, to improving understanding of autism and outcomes for autistic people. This is the ADI website, and this is our leadership team. So as Steve said, we have over 1,200 members worldwide, in every continent, and in every specialty, you know. But this is the leadership team, and you know, we have a fabulous team of senior, successful people in all sorts of specialties, who you know who are on the leadership team and help with the advocacy and research work that we do. That's the psych team. All of these people are senior, successful psychiatrists who are openly autistic. And you can find all of our work on our link tree. You can access it through our website. And I think the reason we've focused on research and publications is because we know that as doctors, if you want to make any change in healthcare, the only way to really do that, or the way to start to do that, is through peer-reviewed publications in the medical literature. So that's what we focused on up until now. So you'll find all our work on our link tree. And this is the one that I hope that will really change practice in healthcare for autistic people. It's the Autistic SPACE framework, and what we did was we know that a lot of our colleagues really struggle to support autistic patients, struggle to understand what it means to be autistic and how to help. And what we wanted was a simple, memorable framework that's applicable to all autistic people in any setting. So what we developed was the framework. It's a descriptive acronym, because mostly in any setting, what we need is just a little bit extra space. But it's a descriptive acronym that stands for sensory, predictability, acceptance, communication, and empathy. And we developed it during the pandemic, so everyone was talking about PPE. So we also talked about physical space, processing space, and emotional space. And what we've done since is we've adapted that to various other settings. So it's been adapted for social work, it's been adapted for education, and really it's applicable in any setting. And it really does help to meet the needs, even just to think about what are the aspects of autistic experience that need to be considered in any sort of setting. So these are some of our other papers. As I said, we've adapted it for anesthesia. The experiences of autistic doctors I'll talk to you about in a minute. And we've got lots of papers around healthcare. This is the one that we've just done, which is the Autistic Space for Inclusive Education. That's just published in Neurodiversity Journal. And I'm really hoping that that will make a difference for autistic kids in education because, gosh, we need that badly. These are our barriers to healthcare project, which I don't have time to get into in detail today, but they are both open access, so they're freely available. A couple of highlights from it: we looked at barriers to healthcare, and we found that the healthcare access barriers experienced by autistic people were associated with adverse health outcomes. So people having untreated mental health problems, untreated physical health problems, not making it to specialist referrals, late presentations, needing additional treatment or surgery, and a third of the autistic respondents described a potentially life-threatening condition that they did not access healthcare for. And a lot of those were and they were associated with the adverse with the access barriers. In terms of the barriers, using the telephone was the single biggest barrier. And so much of our healthcare system is based around telephone contact, even in terms of making an appointment. Over half of the autistic respondents avoided or delayed a GP visit, family doctor visit, just because they didn't feel that they were going to be understood. So we really need to improve healthcare for autistic people. And what we then did was we looked at, it was a mixed methods project. We looked at the qualitative data. And this was a way of looking at the stories behind the statistics. And we found a really plausible pathway from early access barriers down to healthcare avoidance and serious adverse health consequences. And we talked about the triple empathy problem, again, which I might come back to at the end if we have time. But what I then want to talk to you about is this one, the autistic psychiatrist's experiences of recognizing themselves and others as autistic. I talked about this at the American Psychiatric Association meeting in Los Angeles a while ago. And I published this in the BJ Psych Opens, it's freely available, published it last year. Now, what I will say is it has been the most difficult project that I've been involved in. I have cried more tears over this than I think probably anything else I've done. It's been really, really, really hard on so many levels. And it is data that I almost wish I didn't have, if that makes sense. No, actually, I'm not going to say I almost wish. I wish I didn't have this data because it's really hard. It's really hard to talk about the shame of being autistic. But that is what the data is showing. But it's so important because it's so intricately linked with mental health for autistic people that I think we have to address it. I have to do this. But just to say it is tough. And that's why I said earlier at the beginning, in terms of a content warning, today might not be the day to engage with this, because it is potentially difficult. But anyway, before I do that, let's go back to the Autistic Doctors membership survey. What do we know about autistic doctors at all? I mean, the first time I ever talked about autistic doctors, I subtitled my presentation "Not an Oxymoron." And that was only back in about 2018, because the idea at the time was you couldn't possibly be autistic and be a doctor. How could a doctor be autistic? So yeah, no, it's not an oxymoron. Actually, there's loads of us. There's loads of us in medicine. So this was a study that we conducted in collaboration with the Center for Autism and Neurodiversity at Jefferson Health in Philadelphia. And at the time, we had about 450 members. So we got 225 responses. Most were in the UK. The next were in North America. The next biggest group, were North America. 2/3 had a formal diagnosis. Look at the age of diagnosis. Now, that's not what people tend to expect. People tend to expect, oh, we're all late diagnosed autistic adults. And often the subtext to that is, I'm not really autistic. But a significant minority of our members actually had a childhood diagnosis. 3 was the youngest. And a couple of our leadership team, had childhood diagnoses as well. You know, and again, as you say, it's not what people tend to expect. And the other thing people don't expect is the specialty breakdown, you know. So if you're looking at the box there, have a think about what medical specialties, you know, you might think would be the top three, because it's not what people think. People tend to think it's all microbiologists and pathologists and, you know, radiologists and people who are, you know, hidden away from patients. Not the case at all. General practice. Or family medicine, you might know it as family medicine. That's the biggest group. The second biggest group are psychiatrists. And then when you think about the relative number of psychiatrists compared to family physicians, the question is, are psychiatrists the most overrepresented group, which they seem to be, and then anaesthetists are third. What was interesting was when we looked at the disclosure data, less than a third had disclosed being autistic to their colleagues. You know, and just think about how that feels. You know, again, lovely diagram from James. Think about how that feels to be living your life, working amongst colleagues, and having to hide the core essence of your being. You know, it's tough. It's really hard. It's really hard. We also looked at mental health data from this group, and the suicidality figures are appalling. 77% of our members described experiencing suicidal ideation. 24% had had a previous suicide attempt. A half experienced self-harm. We also looked at how people viewed autism. The majority viewed autism as a difference, over half as a disability. A minority, 13%, viewed autism as a disorder. And the preferred term was autistic rather than doctor with autism. What was really interesting was that considering autism to be a disorder was associated with having attempted suicide, also associated with the preference for terminology, doctors with autism. You know, and there's lots of ways you could look at that, but just thinking about how it feels to grow up with the message that we are at our very core broken, disordered, defective, in need of fixing. It's no wonder that does a number on your mental health. It's no wonder that people, you know, are more likely to not want to, you know, remain on the planet. And it's something that we know the suicide rates for autistic people are way, way higher than general population rates. These figures are way, way higher than for, you know, any other doctor group. So that's why it's so important that we look at mental health. And I think the data that's coming out of the Autistic Psychiatrists project, particularly around shame, really potentially holds a vital link between those two things. So what it was a study of 8 senior psychiatrists using interpretive phenomenological analysis. And what that is, it's a qualitative approach to research, qualitative methodology, studying human experience and particularly elements of lived experience that are really meaningful, you know, and it's about how people make sense of their experiences. And it's particularly helpful, particularly useful with an insider researcher, as you know, as I am. All were based in the UK. They were recruited from the ADI psychiatry group. I had 6 consultant psychiatrists and 2 senior associate specialists, a range of specialties within psychiatry, everything from, you know, child and adolescent, general adult, old age, liaison psychiatry, intellectual disability, and some academic psychiatrists as well. 1 had a childhood diagnosis, 2 had adult diagnoses, and 5 self-identified as autistic. Won't go into the demographics except to say, just look at the experience in psychiatry. You know, they'd all been 10, 15, 20 years in psychiatry. 1 had been over 40 years in psychiatry. So there's a lot of experience there. There was 3 themes. The first one was recognizing themselves as autistic and how that happened. The second was recognizing autistic colleagues. And then the third was not recognizing autistic patients. And what they said was, if we don't recognize ourselves from training, if we don't recognize ourselves as autistic, how on earth can we diagnose patients accurately? You know, and when you think about it, it makes so much sense. You know, patient goes for an autism assessment. I think I'm autistic. You know, clinicians, you know, like tells the clinician, you know, I take it literally, need routine. It's a fairly standard list of autistic sort of features, you know, and the clinician goes, sounds just like me. I'm not autistic. And then, you know, confidently declares you're not autistic, you know, but it's a wrong diagnosis. And that's happening because loads of autistic psychiatrists don't recognize themselves, don't realize that they are autistic. So anyway, so that paper came out back in October last year, and I got a lot of really good response to it. The American Psychiatric Association put out a daily alert, and then they did a feature on it later on, which was lovely. They've been really supportive. Also, the Royal College of Psychiatrists in the UK have been incredibly supportive of this work as well, because they recognise that what we're saying is, you know, is actually true. This one was really cool. I really like this one. In what might be the medical equivalent of a plot twist, researchers have discovered that some of the psychiatrists who diagnose autism in others are themselves autistic. They just haven't realized it yet. I thought I like that one, that medical equivalent of a plot twist. But the thing is, a lot of them have realized. That's the thing. It was, you know, some haven't, but a lot have. But around the time then that this was that the paper was out, what I noticed was I was getting a very different reaction to the sort of reaction that I would usually get when I publish a new paper. You know, I'd have a lot of people who would interact with me online, who would comment about the paper, who would, you know, there'd be a lot of, you know, discussion and engagement. And that wasn't happening with this one. I was getting lots of reposts, and I was getting, you know, likes, and I was getting a lot of private messages and emails. People that would usually interact publicly were not. And I was thinking about it. What was going on? And at the time, I was also looking at the data around diagnosis and disclosure. So it was the reasons why, particularly the ones who hadn't had a formal diagnosis, why they avoided it. Basically, I was looking to see why would they seek it, but none of them were. Why were they specifically avoiding a formal diagnosis, and then why they might or might not disclose. I mean, none of them had disclosed. So I was looking at that data, and it was all to do with the negative attitudes, the negative consequences. I mean, there are genuinely negative career consequences for doctors in general disclosing being autistic, but psychiatrists in particular. You know, because there's this idea that, well, you know, what, you can't be autistic. You know, if you're autistic, then of course you have no empathy, so you can't be a psychiatrist. And now we know that's nonsense, but that is the dominant sort of feeling in the field. You know, participants were afraid of not being believed, or the corollary to that was being believed, but then losing their credibility. People describe the diagnostic criteria as a barrier to disclosure, also as a barrier to recognizing themselves, because, you know, they're so negative. I mean, in essence, the current diagnostic criteria are a list of how have you failed to be neurotypical. You know, there's no room for autistic thriving, which is entirely possible. So it's all to do with the stigma, the stereotypes, myths, misconceptions, not having any role models. You know, just that sense of being judged and witnessing the reaction to others who did disclose, you know, and the outcomes to disclosure being very uncertain, because they are, you know, and we have seen, like in ADI, we have supported members who have been basically kicked out of medical school or kicked out of training, postgraduate training, just because they've disclosed being autistic. And we've supported them to, you know, challenge that, and some have been successful and been reinstated. But that is the field in which we work. So it is really dangerous for a lot of people to disclose, but not for all. And I had a sense that there was more than that going on. It wasn't just that. And it took me a while to figure out what was going on. And then suddenly, as I say, the shame bomb dropped. I realized what was pervasive through all the entire data set that I had was just this sense of shame. Now, I knew very little about shame at the time. So I fell into this rabbit hole of shame, learning everything I could about it, which was, it completely took over my life for weeks. But what I realized was this was absolutely true. I went back and I looked for, I mean, I wouldn't have known paralinguistic indicators of shame. I wouldn't have had any idea what this was all about. But basically, it's, you know, things that the sort of non-verbal indications of shame. And I went back through all of my recordings with this newfound knowledge, and yeah, sure enough, it's all there the whole way through. I look at it and I go, how did I not see it the first time I analyzed this data? But, you know, hey, I didn't. But it's absolutely there. So I just want to give you a little really quick indication of what it feels like. I'm going to show a very short video. It's about a minute. it was recreated from one of the participant interviews, with the permission from the participant, needless to say, from the transcript and the voice recording by two neurodivergent actors. Hopefully it'll play. Basically, the scene was, it was the participant had chosen to be interviewed in her garden because she didn't want to be overheard by the people that she lived with or anyone else. Anyway, let's see if this will play. What do I need to do to make it play?
Hold on a second. I think it's hello, is anyone there? No, I think it's the next door neighbor's dog who huffed. Is anyone there? Is that a naughty dog? No, I think it's animal. It's not a person. I just keep hearing intermittent rustling. Okay.
Just to stop you, if you want to reschedule this to a time that,
No.
Okay.
It's fine. I just keep hearing weird rustling sound in the undergrowth between our garden and the next garden. I'm actually gonna go slightly more over here at the back of the lawn. Right. It's all going in the transcript, isn't it? The general paranoia and persecution.
totally understandable.
As a theme, we can put that as a theme.
Absolutely, the terror of being discovered. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, just thinking about how that feels as a consultant psychiatrist, to be working and concealing that, and just that terror of being discovered. But what is this terror all about? I mean, as we think back to how we viewed homosexuality, it's only 50 years ago, that was in the DSM, and it was the same sort of thing, that terror of being outed. We absolutely have to change the discourse around this. But looking at where it comes from, it was so clear from all my data that it's childhood messages, it's family, school, peers, social rejection, bullying, workplace conflicts. So it is so much of our lived experience is lived in this sense of chronic shame. I presented this project at the American Psychiatric Association meeting. This is the poster that I presented. Just to show you a few close-up quotes from it, this sense of, I can't be this thing. I remember that feeling when I got my own diagnosis. I remember that feeling that day. I can't be. No, obviously it was, long time ago. It was back when I had that sort of core deficit framing. That's all I knew about autism. I didn't have the sort of, modern perspective on autism that I have now, but that was my sense. I can't be. Participants described being considered an odd child, a bit of a horrid child. Oh, this one, if she'd even tried a bit harder to be a bit normal, a bit more normal, easily disliked, easily rejected, as if there was something wrong, And then one of the participants said, my mother's personal insult to her to say that her daughter was just so dysfunctional as a child. Remember my parents being very worried and showing me as a specimen to each other. What is wrong with her? And there's just that sense, of throughout our entire lives, what is wrong with her? It's no wonder the mental health outcomes for autistic people are just so appalling. This was one of the participants came to realize that they were autistic, having been asked to assess a junior colleague. And actually tell you how the other ones did. Some of them came to realize that they were autistic because the same journey as my own, because of their kids that were diagnosed initially. Others recognized it during medical training, maybe during a lecture or or in a clinic with autistic kids. Some of them were recognized by their patients, which is quite cool, I think. Patients going to the psychiatrist, "You're one of us, aren't you?" That's how they knew. Anyway, to get back to this one, how he felt about it was that he felt very uncomfortable. Took quite a long time to recognize or to acknowledge that, yeah, he was autistic. And what did that say about him? Another participant, wondering who else knew. This was quite a poignant story. It was somebody who had a friend who was a clinical psychologist, and they'd known each other since they were in the early days of primary school, so since they were 5. What she said to her colleague when she realized she realized this through a lecture, and she said, "Do you think, is there any chance I might be in total hypochondriac here? Could I have like the girls' version of autism?" And her friend went, "How's that taking you so long to realize?" She's like, "I thought you knew already." My participant was like, "Well, no." And here's what she said. When she said that, I felt a bit like, oh gosh, she's known this behind my back and not said anything. And then I felt a bit like humiliated. Maybe other people would know. I felt a bit thick being a psychiatrist who's had 7 years of therapy, who would diagnose and recognize autism in other people. For me to not realize that till like 40 is a bit, whoa, ridiculous. And some of the others said, similar things. The idea that, well, if you have a disorder like autism, you must have a functional impairment. And therefore, by definition, there's potentially something wrong with you doing your job. And this is an issue that the autistic psychiatrists have much more so than other specialties, And others said that the impression is that, oh, well, you must have it so mild that it doesn't matter, or somebody clearly didn't do a good job at the assessment if they've given you that label, or if you really have it, then you're probably in the wrong job. And it's this sense that, psychiatry, it's so cerebral. I worry that people would think, well, if there's something wrong, you couldn't possibly have empathy. You won't be able to communicate. All things that we know are not true, but these are, the myths and misconceptions that are, that are out there about autistic people. This is potentially maybe the most difficult aspect of this, particularly for me as a parent, particularly because so much of what drives the advocacy that I do is not knowing with my older daughter, and the regret and the guilt and the shame that I feel around how I parented her, and then my younger one, he's grown up in that neurodiversity paradigm, and gosh, what a difference, what a difference in terms of his outcome. His older sister looks at him, poignantly and just goes, "Oh, if only." We do together, I do too. If only we had known when she was little what we knew later. But it's like that fabulous Maya Angelou quote: "You do the best you can," like, and when you know better, you do better. And anyway, I got distracted. The generational shame is tough. When I asked the participants about their own kids, now these were participants who were, in general, neuroaffirmative in their approach towards themselves and their own patients. When it came to their own kids, they demonstrated a latent neuronormative expectation that was quite a contrast. One of them masks massively, really tries to be normal. She's learned, she's done really well, she's got friends. Another participant talking about a kid who was quite solitary. Suppose more recently I've become more positive about it, but you need to be able to interact with people to have social skills. We need to help you get to that level. Another one was described as uncomfortably similar. And then another one, this one hurts. Even to read, it was about a 10-year-old daughter. No, so far I haven't seen anything. She seems quite all right. What a way to frame not being autistic, But that is the dominant sort of cultural narrative that as autistic kids, as autistic people, we inhabit. That is what autistic kids are growing up with day after day. And that's why I think we really have to talk about this. This one was a participant who went to a mother and baby group. This was after she was a qualified psychiatrist, but before she knew she was autistic herself. She went to a mother and baby group and encountered a mother who disclosed being autistic. And what she said was, "I remember thinking, how can this person be a mother if they're autistic? How are they going to get their child's state of mind? Is that actually emotionally safe for this person to be a mother?" And she said, "If I was thinking that as a doctor with a training in psychiatry, there's no way other psychiatrists are not going to think that about me." Another one shared their diagnosis with their local specialist autism team. And what she said was they were surprised that any autistic doctors existed. "This is a specialist autism team. I think they wondered if I had really had a proper diagnosis." And then she shared a case. She presented a case at one of their multidisciplinary team meetings. And what she said was it was deeply unpleasant being watched for signs of autism. So bad that as soon as I finished, I couldn't stop crying. It's tearing me up. I never felt like that before. I know that feeling. I know what that's like. I'm used to it at this stage, you know, and it's fine. But I know what that feels like, you know. I didn't realize in the beginning of all this work that it was shame, but that is what it is. And the thing about shame, it's like it's a huge emotion. But it's this hidden. It's like that proverbial elephant. You know, it's so big. We bump into it all the time, but nobody mentions it. Nobody sees it. It's been called the master emotion, and it's related to our identity. It's different from guilt. Guilt is about things that we've done. Shame is about who we are. And it's about that sense of seeing the self as defective. Oh, it's deeply, deeply painful. And it's associated with mental health problems, with substance use, with anxiety, with depression. There's so many negative consequences. And also the experience of chronic shame and shame avoidance and shame anxiety, the sense of living your life in such a way as to avoid the experience, the emotion, the feeling of shame. It's incredibly maladaptive. But the thing is, so many autistic people are existing in this state without having any idea. We talk about stigma a lot. In the autistic world, in autism research, we talk about stigma, but we never talk about how that stigma is experienced on a personal, emotional level. And that's shame. And the thing is, the reason it's important to talk about is that then gives us a choice. Because there isn't an awful lot that we can do individually. Yes, collectively, we can do a huge amount to counter societal stigma. But on an individual level, there really isn't a lot that we can do. But we can tackle our own shame. And if we do that collectively, then we will absolutely accelerate that shift in paradigm, which is so badly needed. How do we do it? It's really hard. I'm at the beginning of this journey in terms of the research that I want to do next. But what we can do is look at self-compassion, you know, and it's something that is so important because as autistic people, we're constantly regularly being criticized and told that we're not good enough. And we absorb those messages. And so often we're, you know, reiterating those messages to ourselves when what we really need to do is we need to be compassionate to ourselves. And that really is the antidote to shame. Shame competence is a concept that's developed by Professor Luna Dolezal, who runs the Shame and Medicine Project, which is incredibly helpful. And it's we all need to become shame competent because in healthcare, so much of what happens between healthcare professionals and parents is shame. It's shame based, you know. As as parents of autistic kids, we are shamed for our kids not meeting milestones, for our kids' behaviors. We're shamed by education professionals. You know, it is constantly. I wrote a blog a while ago about, you know, about this experience, you know, about trading shame. So much of what we're doing in our interactions on a daily basis, particularly around, you know, around autism, and yet we don't recognize it. So shame competence is really important. Disclosure where safe, because we really need role models, but we also have to recognize that disclosure is absolutely not safe for a lot of people. Just being vulnerable, you know. I love that quote. The antidote to shame is vulnerability. Shame dies when spoken about in safe places, you know, or as Brene Brown says, you know, what shame needs is secrecy, silence, and judgment. You know, and then this one, when it comes to shame, understanding it is a prerequisite for change. And that's really, you know, what I'm trying to do, as hard as and all as this is. But here's one that I you know, tried to show my own vulnerability. This was, I won't tell you too much about it, but you can read about it. It's published in The Lancet. A meltdown that I had at a speaking venue that was a sensory nightmare. It was absolutely hideous. And I was expected to talk in the middle of this busy exhibition space, not even in a room. It was out in the middle of the space. Anyway, you can read about it if it's interesting. But I really wanted to use the platform I have just to be vulnerable and to just write about the dark days, because it can be very difficult to talk about being autistic and being a doctor at all, never mind talking about the challenges that we all face. And the thing is, that's what really drives so much of what I do. It's like there are so many commonalities right across the autistic spectrum, no matter how different we can look, heterogeneity we know is enormous within the field of autism. And we often focus on the differences, but we have an awful lot more to gain by focusing on what's shared, on the commonalities. Anyway, I shall move on. Some of our med students are great. This is one of the papers that is currently in production at this stage, I hope. It's the idea that participants didn't disclose their autism diagnosis because of consequences, and the negative associations promoted a sense of shame. Culture of silence about being autistic was embedded in their experience. It's like if you have it, it's a dirty secret and you don't let people know. We can't let the next generation grow up like that. We just can't. One of the other participants, said, if you behave as if it's something that you send the message that it's something to be ashamed of. And for other autistic people, it was important for me to not act as though I'm ashamed of it. Everyone thinks of me as a weird, odd thing, but just seeing other people like owning it made me want to own it. And that's the way forward. I think so many of the next generation are starting to grow up confidently autistic. They're just out there. They're just, openly autistic. And that is what is going to drive change. But I think what we really need are some senior role models. And I see this in the autism research world as well. A lot of the younger researchers are acknowledging being autistic, but amongst the senior group, there's still that sense of no shame. We're not disclosing this. But this isn't new, Like lots of you will be familiar with the DSM. Hopefully, most of you will be familiar with Steve Silberman, who we sadly lost recently, and his book Neurotribes. Here's what he said about the DSM. The DSM-3, now remember, that changed the field of psychiatry completely. Here's what Steve said. The DSM-3 was the product of a mind that exhibited many classic qualities of autistic intelligence. And yet, potentially, such an enormous contribution to psychiatry from a potentially autistic psychiatrist, led by a potentially autistic psychiatrist, and yet our psychiatrists are the least likely to be able to disclose. We have to change that. We have to change that, because the thing, this is my life. I see autistic people everywhere I go, and they don't know they're autistic. A lot of them don't know they're autistic. Now, a lot of them do know, but can't disclose. But what we do know is, I know there's an awful lot of talk about the widening criteria and the, rising prevalence and, all of that. And whatever we can say about kids, whatever, what we absolutely have to acknowledge is that for the vast majority of older autistic people, they are unrecognized and undiagnosed. And we have to normalize just being autistic in all sorts of fields, in medicine, in every research, in every field there is, because we are everywhere. We mask a lot and you mightn't recognize us, but we're everywhere. So one thing I would say is, many of you may be listening thinking, yeah, you're autistic, or you're thinking maybe you are, and you're wondering whether or not you should disclose. The reality is autistic people in your lives probably know already. And again, it's important because of healthcare. We really have to start talking about this. We have to smash down the stigma and the shame about being autistic, because it links into our healthcare outcomes and the pathways through healthcare. Haven't time to get into this, but shame absolutely contributes to our negative healthcare experiences. And the thing is, it's as I said earlier, it's in our everyday interactions. We're shamed for being autistic. Parents experience vicarious shame through seeing their kids being shamed. Healthcare professionals feel shame because of a lack of training, and also then shame parents because of maybe the kids not meeting milestones. It's rife in education, and whether that's around academic performance or commonly behavior. And then there's what we term the autism wars between autistic advocates and, autism parents. So much of that is shame-based. And I was at a conference recently, and, somebody asked a question about and acknowledged not being very, very familiar with autism, and wondered if shame was the thing that links us all. And suddenly I thought, yeah, absolutely. Autistic advocates, autism researchers, parents, we all want the same thing. But essentially what we're doing in a lot of the, the disputes and discussions that happen, a lot of it is just trading shame. If we know about it, if we recognize what we're doing, we then have choices. We can do things differently. And again, going back to where it started for me, my lad is growing up confidently autistic, which is an opportunity that I didn't have, my daughter didn't have, but it's an opportunity that I want for all autistic kids. And as one of our psychiatrists, she's the CAMS lead, the Child and Adolescent Mental Health lead for ADI, Dr. Anna Rabowska. She did an interview for the Times newspaper, where she said, what are we doing to the next generation if all the successful autistic people are in hiding? And I just think we have to acknowledge, while it is absolutely an individual choice for every single person, we need to think about the collective picture and the bigger picture of, potentially perpetuating stigma and shame by non-disclosure. Anyway, I'll leave it at that. Please do feel free to get in touch. That's our website and our link tree, and my email. And I'm more than happy to have a chat and take some questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Doherty. That was a beautiful presentation. Really important topics about long-term care and the impact of shame. So we do have a pretty good question here for you. If anyone else wants to type in questions, we've got about 10 minutes. Just use the Q&A there, and we'll go ahead and get started. We have a question from someone named Anna. She says, it seems that autism perception issues stems from putting a severe/profound or nonverbal autism that is a developmental disorder and autism that is neurodivergent condition under the same umbrella. Both sides of the spectrum suffer from the wrong perception. The severe side is desperate for research and treatment. The neurodivergent side suffers from lack of acceptance. Would it be right to separate them into unique categories since their needs are so different? Thank you so much for sharing your research. It's very insightful.
Okay, I'm going to be controversial here, and I'm going to say that's a false dichotomy. I know that, there are people who are, really passionate on both sides and really feel strongly that I have nothing in common with, somebody who is nonverbal, for example. It's not true. I would have thought that too. The beginning of my, the beginning of my journey into this sort of world of autism, I would have thought that. Absolutely not true. I think of support needs as dynamic and fluctuant and frequency based. So I don't ever think in terms of, severity. Because what happens is the way that, for example, I respond, like read my Lancet article, the way that I respond in a really difficult situation is very similar to an autistic person who doesn't speak or who has, complex needs and needs residential care. And while our needs on a, daily basis are very, very different, qualitatively, they're similar. And what I also notice is that there's a lot about the autistic experience that has only been recognized in recent years because speaking autistic people have been able to talk about our internal experience. So it's things like sensory needs, burnout, the need for predictability, and how that feels, autistic inertia or motor issues, things that affect our peers who are non-speaking, who cannot express this for themselves, are just things that we, as speaking autistic people, we experience. And we feel, and like I find myself, I've written about this actually. I should have put the link in. I have a piece called Weaponized Heterogeneity, because I think that's how I think of this question. I think of the desire to split the spectrum. I call that weaponized heterogeneity, because what happens is it's recognizing the heterogeneity, but it's only recognizing the difference. And recognizing the difference and wanting to split us up, all that does is it harms the most vulnerable people in our community, because it excludes them from the lived experience, the collective lived experience that autistic people share. I think it's far more valuable to focus on the commonalities rather than the much more obvious differences. But absolutely, we need to look at support. And I think, there's a profound need for support for autistic people, particularly those with the highest support needs. But splitting us up into two different groups, no, I don't agree. I don't think there's a validity to it. And autistic people know that that's not the case. Usually it is non-autistic people who want to do that. Usually, not always. Sometimes there are autistic people who would be experiencing a degree of maybe internalized ableism and don't want to acknowledge the similarities between themselves and people with much more complex needs. And again, I might have been in that category a decade ago, but I go to conferences or I go to service providers where autistic people with complex needs either are receiving services, or recently it was a conference for non-speakers. Today I was doing a session again for the Autism Europe Congress with an autistic young woman with we were recording something who has an intellectual disability, and like on the surface we have nothing in common, but our lived experience qualitatively we absolutely do. I go into those spaces and my body resonates. I resonate with that experience. The difference is I can mask, and I do mask, maybe less than I used to, but that's the difference. So no, I absolutely do not think that is. Sorry, I rambled quite a bit on that question, but it's something
No,
I feel passionate about, because we absolutely need, the right supports for all autistic people, and the way to get that is by using the lived experience of all autistic people, particularly autistic academics and clinicians.
Thank you. That was a really good, really in-depth response. I think it's good to put on a different perspective and kind of see what else is out there. We've got one more question here about any advice from someone named Teresina. Any advice for families who are experiencing shared stigma and or shame? And then I'm not sure if I understand the second half of this question, but you may also, how widespread is autism spectrum condition instead of autism spectrum disorder? I believe they're referring to the semantics or the wording there, the title that's given.
Yeah, I never use disorder. We're not disordered. Do you know, there's nothing wrong with this. That's like, that's my view. I know a lot of people will disagree. I don't actually use condition either. Like you wouldn't refer to ethnicity as a condition. You wouldn't refer to sexuality as a condition. And again, it's about reframing how you view autism. If you see autism through that traditional core deficit model, then yeah, disorder works. You're going to use that and it's going to seem like it fits. But if you view autism through a neurodiversity paradigm, then absolutely not. No, so I wouldn't use condition even at all. I mean, I would have probably up until a couple of years ago. Neurotype's a good word. But it's a bit like autistic traits. People talk about autistic traits, and sometimes people will acknowledge having autistic traits. And like, I'm going, oh, come on, would you look in the mirror? You're autistic. You're only acknowledging autistic traits because you don't want to acknowledge being a part of this group that you have othered and you don't see as equal. What we need is parity of esteem. But we don't have that yet. We're a long way from that, in both in healthcare, in research, in autism advocacy in general. But that's where we need to get to, because, having kids growing up believing that they're disordered, think about what that's going to do to their mental health by the time they're teenagers or adults, you know? Yeah, it's all to do with the framing.
And then the second part of that question was if you have any advice for families who are experiencing this sort of shared stigma or shame that you've been discussing.
Yeah, absolutely. As a parent, I think your responsibility is to first recognize it, which is, you know, which you know, that question is doing, but then is to challenge it. Do not let anybody shame your child. Do not let teachers shame your child. You know, certainly recognize it in our parenting, and you know, I do myself, you know. And what I'm thinking at the moment around what I want to do with the whole area of kind of shame competence, as I'm learning more about it, is translate that to shame sensitive parenting. You know, we're talking about shame competence and shame sensitive practice in healthcare. We need to do that in terms of parenting. So that's something that's swirling around in my mind as to how the best way to do that is, because there's a huge need for that. But do not. Lunadolazole has a brilliant paper in the Lancet, which I'll add into the slides, so you'll have that. And it's about shame competence, and it's the steps in terms of shame competence, and it's everything from recognizing it to not shaming. I mean, how much of our parenting is about shaming our kids? You know, we do that it's intuitive. We don't even recognize that that's what we're doing. And I think it's a journey for parents to move from that traditional shame-based parenting, which is what most of us experienced, to a shame-sensitive approach to parenting. So I do want to develop some resources around that, and you know, at some point. But they're just the things to think about. But don't let teachers shame your kids. Now, you know, stand up for your kids. You know, what I find with mine, particularly my younger one, I mean, he's, you know, the most obviously autistic of the lot of us, particularly when he was little, you know, and I would be maybe in a restaurant and he was, you know, being, typically autistic. It's not an oxymoron, but you know what I mean. You know, and you might see the disapproving looks. You don't accept that. So what I used to do was I would make eye contact deliberately with whoever was doing that, look at my child and smile as in, isn't he wonderful? You know, if you model that. I also say that when I'm doing healthcare work for receptionists in healthcare. If you model acceptance for autistic patients in the waiting room who are maybe getting a hard time, you know, from other patients, that people learn by our reactions. So I would say challenge it where you can, and you can't always, you know, and there are some battles that it's just easier to walk away from. But where you can, don't let anyone shame your kids. And it's the same for family members as well. A lot of us, you know, deal with maybe extended family who, you know, might have a lot to say about how we might parent our kids. No, we need to support our kids to grow up confidently autistic. And we do whatever it takes to let that happen, you know. Again, sorry, a bit of a rant because it's something that I'm so passionate about, but it's life-saving, you know, for so many of our kids. It really is. Because there's nothing more wonderful than confidently autistic kids, and it is possible.
Thank you for that in-depth response. If you have a few more minutes, we do have 2 more questions.
Oh, this is my special interest. I'll talk about this all day, every day.
Okay, perfect. So this one, you may not have any insight on this, but I'm going to ask you from Elizabeth. Do you have insight into the number of neurodivergent people in prisons and the care that they receive there? And then also thanking you for your insights into shame as a parent. It's very insightful.
That is a really big issue that needs so much more attention. Yeah, absolutely. There are loads. And there are even more in the forensic mental health services, you know, who would have similar issues. Excuse me. I think there's an awful lot of unrecognized ADHD. And again, that's something that I didn't touch on at all, which is the fact that most of us are multiply neurodivergent. You know, I mean, like, you know, autism doesn't come on its own, really. Loads of us are dyspraxic, dyslexic, ADHD, you know, so just thinking in terms of multiple neurodivergence. But in the prison population, I think probably ADHD is unrecognized ADHD is probably a bigger issue numerically. But absolutely, there are so many autistic people. wrongly and needlessly in the prison system. And again, I think it goes back to insights from autistic clinicians, because we have quite a few who are involved in, forensic cams. And we need to be listening to these people, because what's happening is there's a lot of families who would have kids who are potentially on that pathway, kids who do have conduct issues, who have, who maybe have low empathy. And that's the other thing that we need to look at. There's this thing about, the pushback against the zero empathy and the hyper empathy, which is absolutely real. But I think we've pushed that hyper empathy narrative a little bit too far. And we're excluding the group of autistic people who do genuinely experience no or low empathy. And particularly for kids, they need a different approach. So there's a lot that can be done to deflect people, kids on that pathway, but only if we know about it. So there's a huge amount of work to be done in that. I would love to see the Autistic SPACE framework adapted for forensic settings, but again, I know that resources are such that, the prison environment is horrendous for anybody, but I can only imagine how much worse it is, for autistic people. The noise, the clanging, the predictability would be good, but apart from that, no. So we absolutely need to, acknowledge these issues, because the problem is, as one of our psychiatrists said recently, if an autistic, they were talking about their autistic patients, and special interests, and they said if an autistic person develops a special interest in something that is illegal, it's practically impossible to keep them out of prison or forensic services. And that is so true. And we absolutely need to be acknowledging that, and finding innovative ways to address those issues. But yeah, it is an issue for sure.
Thank you so much for that. The second part of that question is wondering if you know of another diagnostic tool that's available today that is not so deficit-based. And I know there's a lot coming out about that currently.
Yes, I do, but I haven't looked at it in a while, so I don't want to get into the specifics, except to say that I know that probably the most exciting recent innovation that I've come across, the most recent group that I've come across, is a group that was established by an autistic psychologist, Dr. Hannah Morton. She's at, I'm sorry, where her institution escapes me, but she has established a group for autistic autism diagnosticians. So it's the Autistic Autism Diagnosticians Collective. It was established just after INSAR recently, and within about 2 weeks, it had 150 members in the group. Yeah, so that's the group that we need to be accessing the collective insider knowledge, and because that's the work that I'm doing. It's all about the insider perspectives of medical professionals around healthcare. But we really need to be broadening that out, and that's work that I am hoping to be able to do in terms of just tapping into that knowledge, that dual insider perspective, and developing, tools that are fit for purpose, not just a list of how have you failed to be neurotypical.
Well, it's a very hopeful group that's forming. I love that. Thank you for sharing that information. We have one more question here that pertains to what we spoke about earlier, our non-speaking autistic peers and their treatment within society. And this is an anonymous attendee wondering what you think can be done to uplift and change the perception towards them. And then thank you for sharing your inclusive thoughts about the spectrum.
We need to start at the very beginning and prioritize communication, not speech, communication. Yeah. There is this focus on oral speech that is just, it's not needed. What we need is communication for autistic kids as early as possible, by whatever means possible. Every autistic child needs AAC, whether they speak or not. Like myself and my son, we'll text each other in the same room. I text my friends when, when we could easily speak. We might be on a Zoom call and we'll all use the chat function rather than talking, because speech is effortful for autistic people in the way that it isn't for non-autistic people. That's a generalization, of course, but that is the reality. So we need AAC devices for every autistic child, but particularly those who have speech delays, and as early as possible, and not seeing it as a bridge to speech. If people develop speech, great. But if they don't, that needs to be valued too, And I think if we do that within a few short years, we're going to change the attitudes. If we have people going around with their devices and feeling free to use and not being shamed for using their devices, because again, that goes back to education, and it goes back to therapy, and it goes back to that sort of dominant discourse that we should be prioritizing speech. If an autistic kid who can speak prefers to use an AAC device, what's the problem? Let them. So we need to normalize using AAC. We need to normalize it in healthcare. We need to normalize it in education, and we need to just advocate for our non-speaking peers. I mean, I was at a conference recently for non-speaking people, and it was just, I think it was probably where I was the most unmasked that I have ever been, and it was just wonderful. And it was like, it's just so important that we acknowledge and accept and include our non-speaking autistic peers, and autistic people with intellectual disabilities, and not see us as two separate groups. But absolutely, it's all to do with advocacy, and it's about, there's a brilliant organization in Ireland who are actually hosting the Autism Europe Congress next week. So anybody who's interested, if you can get to Ireland, there are still a few tickets left. It is going to be the most amazing conference. But they, As I Am, is the Ireland's autism charity, and they have a fabulous program underway where they're providing AAC devices to kids and families, and it's just so basic. But why is this not the norm? That's really where we need to get to, and then we need to just normalize it, And again, that happens when speaking autistic people sometimes use it too. Like there are times that I get so overloaded, particularly at airports, that I just can't. I have no words. And again, it's about normalizing being autistic and communicating in authentic autistic ways. If I say to an autistic friend who's in the room with me, no words, it's totally fine. They get it, and just acknowledging that. So I have an app on my phone called Emergency Chat, and sometimes I have to use it. I have no alternative but use it. Again, as I say, usually at airports, and it's just about acknowledging that. And again, the more autistic people who can be open about these challenges, just the easier we normalize it for everybody. But we need far more research, particularly on our the experience of being non-speaking, and that, again, as I say, the research that I'm hoping to do will particularly focus on that population.
Fantastic. That's thank you for taking on that important research, as you've said. We have one question from an attendee about if there's a virtual option to attend the Europe conference next week.
Unfortunately not. No, it is worth the flight though.
And then we have
it's brilliant. I'm just going to say, I mean, the scientific committee for this conference is majorly autistic. The chair of the scientific committee is autistic, and it has been designed, in such a way it's going to be different to any other autism conference. So yeah, if you can get there, do.
Well, if there's a summary paper from what goes on, hopefully we'll grab that from you as well.
Yeah, for sure. And follow it online as well. There'll be a lot of online content, and yeah.
Phenomenal. Well, we've got one more question going back to, I think, your introduction of the talk, maybe from someone who arrived a little bit late. But what is the Autistic Doctors International? If you want to just give us another summary of that.
Autistic Doctors International, ADI. It is probably the achievement in my life that I am most proud of, apart from my two kids. It is a group of autistic medical doctors. So I founded the group in 2019, and we started with less than 10. And these were people that I'd linked up with online. And I mean, it was it was a few years after I got my own diagnosis. Um, and I remember thinking, can you be autistic and be a doctor? What happens now? What happens in my career? Can't, how does this work? Couldn't find anyone else. It was years before I found someone else. But I knew that there was loads of us. As I looked around my colleagues, it was like, no, I knew I'm not the only one. So yeah, so I founded the group. So we started off, as I said, in 2019 with less than 10 members, and we now have 1,200 members, spread right across the world, in all sorts of medical specialties, in all continents, including Antarctica, which is quite cool, I think. And we're just a group, we're a vibrant community of pals, really, essentially, and colleagues. But we're also active in research, advocacy, education, training. We particularly research healthcare experiences for autistic people, and also the needs of autistic medical professionals. And basically, we do what we can to change the world for autistic people, make it better.
Fantastic. And that would be also my most pride and joy if I had been able to do something so miraculous. So thank you so much for your time, Dr. Doherty. Thank you for your questions. Everybody, Steve, if you have a few words you want to say before we log off.
Yeah, I just want to thank Mary again. Yeah, very insightful. I've learned a lot, even though I've been involved in the autism field for almost 50 years. And we first met earlier this year, and you're helping us with a lot of different projects. I very much appreciate it.